In this series, we cover the many products, promos, and pack-ins available to support Dungeon Masters and players within the world of Eberron. Magic informs and suffuses every aspect of the world, so in this episode, we look at a book that explores that topic, the appropriately named Magic of Eberron. This is the Eberron Collector. Magic of Eberron was released in October of 2005 as the sixth hardcover book supporting the world of Eberron. The writers of the book were Bruce Cordell, Stephen Schubert, and Chris Thomason. It is 160 pages long and uses the revised 3rd edition, or 3.5, version of the Dungeons & Dragons rules. The book is still available as a high-quality PDF through the DM's Guild. As of the time of the recording of this video, that's more than 15 years ago. Both Eberron's presentation and the rules have greatly changed, so we're reviewing this book as a source of lore for running the game in the current edition, as well as a source of inspiration for designing new mechanics for 5th edition. The hardcover is divided into 6 chapters, plus a short introduction, so let's look through each of these sections and we'll cover what material is covered in there, and as we go, my opinions on that information. Like if it's still useful based on the lore, or if the information is outdated based on material in other books. I will also mention any material I think would be worthwhile to bring forward into 5th edition mechanically. It would need to be adapted by you, your DM, or one of the many talented writers of the DM's Guild, though, in most cases. The introduction is just 1 page, plus the comic chapter header art. That comic book page has a halfling impure prince character named Eldred, who is statted out in chapter 3, about to take out a Dolgrim. The beginning of the section, there are a few paragraphs continuing Eldred's story. Then the actual text of the section is about the sources of some of the magic of Eberron. Now, while none of this information presented here is strictly obsolete, it doesn't really talk about what I believe are the unique aspects of Eberron's magic as a science philosophy, nor some of the unique aspects that have been developed later, like Siberian arcane theory and externalist magics, or ideas about how the elves of Arenal have used their longevity to perfect the arcane arts, or any of things like that. But the whole thing is very short and introductory specifically to the topics that are going to be covered in the rest of the books, so it's pretty non-offensive. The first chapter starts with a comic page which shows the release of the bound elemental from an airship during a battle with a Karnathi skeleton. The chapter is 27 pages and covers some general information about various forms of magic available in Eberron, but only the ones that have mechanical elements in one of the later chapters. There are 9 of these topics, plus a look at 2 organizations. Let's briefly look at each of them. The short section on Artifice looks at explaining some of the basics of that system, and then has a bit on House Cannith, specifically Merrick's to Cannith, and the city of Whitehearth that was in Syrie. But it's mostly a retread of information about them that was presented in more detail in other books. The second section is about elemental binding, and here we get a bunch of substantial history and details of the process for Zil binding used in creating the many magical wonders that make use of this magic. the date, 973 YK, and location in Zendrik, Moranzabad, where those principles were first learned, or stolen depending on your perspective, from the Drow, are locked down for the first time. The actual step-by-step process of binding an elemental is covered, with very little of it actually being tied specifically to 3rd edition's magic item crafting rules, so it's easily adapted to other rule systems. This subsection overall is a great source if a character or campaign is focusing on elemental binding. Unlike most of the other sections, binding gets a bit over 4 pages of material, where most of the other topics only get 1 or 2 pages. So you actually get a fair bit of depth here. The next section is about dragon shards themselves, expanding a little on the process of locating and extracting various dragon shards, with a small amount of rules covering the process. One thing I like, even if the subsection is pretty short, is that kyber shards are specifically said to be found in caverns where natural dragon mark formations are found. I like this, since that aspect of dragon marks, that they occur in nature as part of landmarks, is often overlooked, and it's those natural marks that often take a large role in the interpretation of the Draconic Prophecy, which happens to be the next section. The Draconic Prophecy section is largely a retread of material in other sources, but has a few interesting bits, including explicitly tying the formation of dragon marks on humanoids to proximity to dragon shards, which I don't believe has been referenced again since this book. It is a little strange in all of the talk of the dragons involved with the prophecy that the chamber is not mentioned in any place. This section has no rules content, so it's still entirely relevant. The following section is about the magic of the Dalkir, which has some interesting ideas that were not really explored again until recently in exploring Eberron. The Dalkir as masters of alternate realities. It is said that they reach into alternate realities to get ideas for their flesh crafting and other horrors. The section also first mentions a Dalkir lord just called the Stained One. His Kyber demiplane is also detailed, which is called the Fortress of the Stained. You won't find the material on the Stained One replicated in any other sources, so you need it from this book if you want to learn more about this character. The Dragon Totem Rituals of the Sarens is the next section, though it's very short, basically explaining the role of dragons in Saren culture, and that they do special rituals involving dragon shards that give their warriors special powers. That section is low on content in general, as the rituals are covered in more detail, though still pretty sparse later in the book. The next section, on psionics, is so light on content, there's nothing to contradict anything in later editions, despite there not even really being a psionic class in 5th edition officially yet. There is a subsection here on the Psyforged, special warforged, that will be covered in a bit more detail later in the book. Here it just gives an overview of their origin story. The penultimate section, before looking at organizations, is all about the magic of Erenal. The actual information about their magic is sparse, but there is a bunch of information about the founder of their culture, Eren. This information, however, is actually contrary to a Dragon Shards article written earlier in 2005 by Keith Baker. The story in this book has Eren referred to with he and him pronouns, and involved with the blood magic of giants, and using the knowledge gained from the magic of the giants to attack them and escape their bondage. However, the online article uses she and her pronouns for Eren, and her story has her magically predicting the attack of dragons as the precursor to the escape of the elves. Future writings seem to take the account from the Dragon Shards article as canon, despite being published earlier. So some extra work is needed if you want to use both accounts. Either that this means that there was more than one Aaron who lent their name to Aaronall, or there was only one Aaron who is gender fluid, as per the recent article on Keith Baker's blog, IFAQ, Non-Binary Elves, and More About Githbron. A link to it will be in the description. If you're going with the one Aaron story, that means they would have predicted the dragon attacks, but also magically cleared away, using the blood magic for the elven escapees. Or you can just make a decision about which specific story is right for your Eberron and the story you're telling. The last of the topical sections is on the magic of Karrnath. This is mostly about expanding upon Karrnath's Ministry of the Dead, led by Count Vedum Ir-Omic, who was mentioned in the Eberron campaign setting. Unfortunately, the Blood of Vol is treated entirely like evil necromancers in this and in later sections, which was a common pitfall many early Eberron projects fell into. It only has hints towards the evolution that the Blood of Vol religion would make once it had been properly developed later. The Red Watchers are introduced here, with a bit more in Chapter 3. They are an anti-undead group within the nation of Karrnath, but they are not mentioned again after this book, and actually feel a little off to me as part of the setting, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. The two organizations covered here are House Tharash's Finder's Guild and the Power of Purity. The session on House Tharash's Finder's Guild was the best resource on this guild up until Dragonmarked was released 13 months later, and still has the best coverage of the Dragon Shard extraction side of the business, including their ranking head of shard extraction, Verloc. The other organization is a brand new one, the Power of Purity, a group of elemental binders who are nominally trying to bind elementals more ethically than other Zil binders are doing it. And I think this only existed and felt important to do in 3.5, as in that edition of the rules, elementals were intelligent sentient beings, and it came up that they might not like being bound to a weapon, airship, or other magic item. In 5th edition, it's not really an issue, as all generic elementals have been written as having no desires other than to embody their element. So a fire elemental just wants to burn, doesn't really care if it's burning a tree, or burning within the fire of Fernia, or burning within a Kyber shard attached to an elemental ring. The second chapter is 16 pages long, starting with a comic page showing a Kalashtar Soul Knife fighting a Warforged Titan. It is also a section that is heavy on the mechanics, so anything here will need to be converted manually to a new edition. Up first are new playable races, the Dalkir Half-Blood and the Psyforged. The Half-Blood is an aberrant humanoid that is born in tandem with a Dalkir symbiote, and has a number of abilities tied to getting symbionts and using them more effectively than most other characters can. Half-Bloods are usually half-humans, which is reflected in them being medium-sized, but can have been born of parents of any race if that parent is bonded with a breed leech symbiont or under experiment of the Dalkir or one of their creatures. Mechanically, there would need to be a bit of work done to bring the Half-Blood through to 5th edition, and while I do think they are actually pretty cool, there are other ways to represent similar ideas already. One of those ways is using the ruin-bound dwarf from Exploring Eberron, which has a similar concept mechanically. It's a bit of a different flavor since it's specifically a dwarf and you're not tied to the symbiont from birth. However, with permission from your DM, you can absolutely use the stats of the ruin-bound dwarf to make any other sort of half-blood character concept you might want, even if they aren't specifically a dwarf. Another interesting way to portray the Dalkir half-blood would be with a subclass, actually, from Morgrave Miscellany, the Warlock Pact of the Host, where you gain magic directly from a symbiont that you're tied with, and has no specific story tie on if you were born with it or not, or anything like that. The other race covered is actually more of a sub-race, the Psyforged, and per the rules of 3.5, they're not even really a sub-race, since it's a body feat. Much like how a Warforged would have a mithril or adamantine body feat representing being built with stronger armor plating. They are presented as Warforged with psionically active crystals embedded into their body, giving them access to great psionic power. If I was adapting this to 5th edition, it would be as some sort of sub-race, though without having any real psionic rules available, I actually don't see much point in doing that. But dropping the Psyforged concept entirely also seems hasty. If you want a Warforged to take the Psychic Warrior subclass of Fighter, the Soul Knife subclass of Rogue, or the Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, which appears in the Tash's Guide to Everything book, absolutely call them a Psyforged. Describe the crystals that help form their body humming with psi energies, and all of that. There's no reason you need the specific mechanics to use the world building that is presented here in this book. The rest of this chapter covers other types of mechanics. The first is an alternate psionic version of the Artificer, basically a rewrite of the Artificer class from the Eberron campaign setting, but using psionic crafting feats from the expanded Psionics Handbook instead of the magic item feats from the Player's Handbook. This version of the class felt unneeded even back in 2005. I see no reason for it to be needed to be brought forward, though I might feel a bit different once a proper psionic class and system are in place in 5th edition, but I still don't expect that. The next set of mechanics are the Dragon Totem rituals I mentioned earlier. There are 8 individual rituals, with many variations of those based on dragon colors. The section goes through mechanically how a ritual is done and what effects it would have. These could be adapted to something more like supernatural gifts in 5th edition, though likely leaning more towards the more flavorful and powerful ones that are in the Mythic Odysseys of Theros, instead of the ones from Dungeon Master's Guide. Though you won't want to give out them at first level like you do in Theros necessarily. If a campaign heavily involves Saron Islanders, I think it might be worth the effort to convert these. The last section in Chapter 2 is feats. There are 30 of them. Now, as feats in 3.5 are very different than the ones in 5th edition, directly translating them is not really advisable, especially since a full third of the feats are related to crafting and using magic items, and there is no real magic item crafting system in 5th edition to build upon. A little under a third of the feats are designed to support other mechanics introduced into the book, like the totem rituals and grafts from Chapter 5 especially. None of the remaining feats feel especially interesting to me, so this section can be mostly skipped over entirely from a modern perspective. This chapter starts with a splash page of a character with the Dragon Prophet Prestige class in Argonesson surrounded by dragons. revealing information about the Draconic Prophecy. Now, if you've never played D&D 3.5, you'll be forgiven for not knowing what a prestige class is. Basically, it's a class that can only be entered after meeting specific requirements. Usually a combination of mechanical requirements, like a specific attack bonus, spellcaster level, or feat or class feature, plus often some sort of role-playing requirement, like being a member of a specific organization, or defeating a specific type of monster, or a few other things. Playtests have been done in 5th edition to bring the prestige class as a concept into the rules system, but they have yet to make it into official books. There are 8 prestige classes in this chapter, so let's look at them and see if they might be worth bringing into 5th edition as a prestige class using the playtest on Arcana mechanics, or in another manner, like a subclass or some other way. The first of the 8 classes is the Alchemical Savant. This class has 5 levels, and is directed towards use by artificers or some other item crafting spellcasters. It doesn't slow down your spellcasting progression like some other prestige classes do. This class specifically is tied to House Cannith with a requirement for a dragon mark or a favored in house feat, and the text teases out a little bit more information about Merrick's Cannith South operations, making it clear that alchemy is actually a key business for Cannith South's operation, even to the point that Cannith members from the East or West branches might look unfavorably towards an alchemist savant, assuming automatically that they're loyal to Merrick's. Mechanically, the class gives some abilities to infuse magic spells into alchemical concoctions to give them a little extra oomph, which otherwise they got a little underwhelming at higher levels in 3.5 edition. As for adapting the class, I don't think you need to, since the 5th edition Artificer already has an alchemist subclass built into it. There's not much point. But the bits of information about Cannith alchemists is definitely still relevant. The second of the prestige classes is the Dead Grim. This is a divine spellcasting class tied to the anti-undead group I mentioned earlier, the Red Watchers, and it covers 5 levels. The theme of this class is taking on characteristics of the undead to fight the undead, and its abilities are mostly tied to favored enemy class features and gaining the immunities and resistances of undead. There is precious little on the Red Watchers here between what was included in the Prestige class and in the previous section, and little else in the book. So, not actually a lot for a DM or player to build a story around, without making up a lot of it themselves. But I do believe there is a good reason that this group has pretty much been dropped and never mentioned again in further Eberron books. They don't really make a lot of sense. Karrnath is under a state of martial law, so it would be quite difficult for a rebel group to form more than 1 or 2 small cells before being found out and eliminated. And this is just not addressed at all in the text. So while I think the concept of the Dead Grim has some legs to it, the idea of using the powers of undeath to fight undeath, the execution, both mechanically and lore-wise, are not great. The actual class here is kind of boring, ability-wise. So if you do want to bring the Red Watchers and or Dead Grim into your game, you will have to do a lot of work to make sure that they make sense and become mechanically interesting if you do adapt the class as well. Okay, so while there are 6 more classes in this chapter and a number of chapters remaining still, to keep the running time reasonable and actually hit my regular release time, I'm going to break here and pick up the rest of the review next week with the Dragon Prophet. So please comment if you have any specific questions about this book. If you do it fast enough, I may be able to address it directly in part 2 of the review of Magic of Eberron. and please subscribe to the Eberron Archaeologist channel so you don't miss the second half of the book. I do also want to mention that this channel does have an Instagram, where I have been running a feature showing off different Eberron miniatures every week. Please follow at Eberron_Arch.